year. But yes, the very day that we launched our first mover, which is the show that starts at 9 o'clock in the morning, is the day that Tesla announced that it had bought $1.5 billion as Bitcoin, and the price soared through new highs, and everything set off into another frenzy. But you know what it feels like, and I don't know, I'd just like to get your take. I know this has been coming, but this week in particular felt like it truly has mainstreamed crypto, blockchain. It feels like it, and all the crazy meme talk, of course, the Dogecoins, somehow it's front and center in the national conversation right now. That's the feeling I get.
Yeah, I do think the normalization of crypto, certainly as a corporate holding or corporate investment, I do think that we have reached a new level of understanding around that. Now, to the extent to which I think that translates into, average consumer awareness, I think is a different question. But I do think it is not going to be surprising to see more and more companies, I would say, become more open about their holdings, right? It's not so much that they're going to, I think, suddenly be buying, it's that they're going to kind of be more transparent about what they're holding. So I know some of the big university endowments are certainly holding various forms of crypto, and they've been more open about that, and conversations about that have been happening. So I think we're just going to see a realization that those who have not kind of thrown their crypto hat in the ring have made a mistake, one could say. So, and I do think that there is that normalization that's happening. So, I assume that next week, or our next episode, there'll be some new announcement that we'll be talking about with probably over time less surprise and astonishment than we were, even a couple of weeks ago or a couple of months ago. And it's great to see.
Yeah, no, it's certainly exciting to be in the media space covering this. I can tell you that much. Okay, so a couple of things I think gives us a nice segue here to Danny, and the one is that, up until I think almost just now, I mean, although maybe a little bit earlier, but Bitcoin has dominated this mainstream conversation in this particular cycle. That seems to go back and forth, and certainly with these big names talking about investing in it. But Ether has had a fabulous run up in price. DeFi has been this explosive thing. A lot going on in the Ethereum world, as I laid out in the monologue. But the other point here that I think is important, and this is where the show, we're going to try to get Danny to help us here with, is as we go mainstream, we run up, as we always do, against that knowledge barrier, the learning curve, the understanding. And look, for the average person, Ethereum is complicated. It's a phenomenally big, expansive, wild idea that has still got a long way to go, but it's something that really needs to be broken down in an understanding. So, Danny, welcome to the show. So I've set you up there. You're going to have to, basically give us the ultimate 101. I think, I suppose, yeah, the standard, what is Ethereum? I gave my description. Maybe something very quick that you have up in your back pocket here would be useful for viewers who are not familiar, listeners who aren't. But the other one is just to talk through what the foundation does, and a little bit about, you as the CEO of the foundation. You're the CEO of Ethereum, right?
Absolutely not.
That joke, of course, is there for a reason, right? Because there's obviously no one in charge, in a classic sense of an organization, a corporate organization, and that's not something that the average person can get their head around always so easily. Right. So talk us through, first of all, what is Ethereum, and how does the foundation, and why does it exist, and how does it operate?
Right. So I think, and you kind of set it up this way, I'm going to use Bitcoin as a foil to talk about what Ethereum is. And I think first and foremost, which is maybe interesting for listeners to understand, is that many would argue Bitcoin is done. Bitcoin as a technology exists and it does what it does. Whereas Ethereum is not. Ethereum is quite simply a work in progress. There are many things that we, Ethereum developers, Ethereum community, are trying to accomplish. And to do that, there is still iterative work to be done. And I spent a lot of my time working on that iterative work in terms of specifications and long-term kind of roadmaps and development. But it is a plane in flight. And although it is not done, there's a kind of very exciting things going on in Ethereum. And to that end, similarly, I'll use Bitcoin as a foil. Bitcoin is very obviously profoundly revolutionary in being able to manage an asset and transfer an asset in a decentralized way and have certain security properties in this like global network around this asset. But foundationally, what Bitcoin does is it has a ledger around this asset, Bitcoin, and rules around the movement of this asset amongst parties. Whereas with Ethereum, you take similar concepts on how to manage this foundational asset in a decentralized way, but instead of just that asset, Bitcoin or Ether, allow for more extensible and arbitrary computation and resolution on this decentralized ledger. That's maybe a little bit abstract. So instead of just a transaction on this global decentralized ledger moving an asset, this transaction instead can do computation, can modify state, can update, can get conditionally move things, conditionally interact with things, and that kind of general extensibility opens up the world of what we call decentralized applications. And so instead of just moving around assets, we're creating kind of decentralized applications. And as you said, one of the huge use cases today is DeFi, decentralized finance, all sorts of rules and programming around essentially taking these decentralized networks and putting new financial rails out there. But there's all sorts of other exciting things going on.
Yeah, I mean, I think the drilling down sometimes into what a DApp is, a decentralized app versus a regular app, is a useful one for people because they know that, you know, the app that they have on their phone is managed and controlled by a centralized entity that can cut them off at any time, right? And then, but the concept of a decentralized app is that yeah, there's a network with nobody in charge, essentially, coordinated through this protocol to manage that app on your behalf, and that enables a whole host of interactivity and exchange, and you said like changes of state that could never be possible if you were just working with a centralized thing. Is that a fair enough way to?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's interesting properties in terms of security if you don't have central entities involved in certain types of exchanges, and maybe in terms of cost, it might be cost minimizing when you don't have a third party involved. But something beyond just those kind of decentralization and security properties, in DeFi, we've seen this, like people call it money Legos, in the sense that like in traditional finance, if asset A was going to interact with asset B, or there might be like particular programmatic ways that they're allowed to, or you have to do it through a bank and they only allow you to do certain things. And often things are still settled on paper and stuff like that. Whereas in decentralized finance and built onto a generically programmable blockchain like Ethereum, there's permissionless innovation on these financial rails. And so I can peer into this protocol or that type of contract, and I can say to myself, well, wouldn't it be interesting or wouldn't it be valuable if we could interact with it in this other way? And you can extend and kind of build upon these, as they say, money Legos.
So I like that frame. I think that's interesting. It's helpful. I think that, you know, we've talked a little bit on the show about how with Bitcoin, there's the protocol, then there's the governance, you know, layer, and then there's the coin itself. And so in the same thing is true in Ethereum. I think that ETH, which is the coin equivalent, it doesn't get the same media attention and just has caught on the public awareness, but there's a similarity there. I think one of the differences that I think is interesting and important to talk about is gas fees. And so the idea that there is this, that ETH is used a lot to actually enable some of the things that you're talking about. And so could you talk a little bit about gas and how it works and how that's a concept that's quite important to the ecosystem?
Mm-hmm. So fundamentally in these decentralized networks, there's usually some sort of scarce resource that is valuable to users. On the Bitcoin network, that's quite simply block space. And it's usually defined in terms of bytes. And there's a fee market because there's a scarce resource that people want to utilize. And there's a fee market, and usually in the Bitcoin world, you pay a price per amount of bytes that are going to go into the blockchain when you submit transactions. And so depending on the day, depending on the usage, there's a going rate for that. And it's going to cost, I don't know, call it 1 penny to $100, depending on the supply and demand there. In Ethereum, the scarce resource is more multidimensional. It's more complex in that there's many things that at a low level, the Ethereum blockchain can do. It can store things in terms of like storing values, storing state, storing objects. It can do arbitrary computations. So it can add things together. It can divide them out. It can move them around. And it does have this like notion of block space as well. And so there's this abstract concept called gas, where the relative complexity of all these operations is priced in this like gas. So it might cost 1 gas to add 2 numbers, but it might cost 1,000 gas to store something in the state of Ethereum. And so the scarce resource is really how much gas can be in a block. Similarly to Bitcoin, how many bytes can be in the size of these blocks. And so there's this fee market around gas. And so it might cost some amount of ETH per unit of gas is like the going market rate for that. And so there's a fee market naturally around that. And if you want to do a simple operation, it might cost a small amount of money to transact. Whereas if you want to do a complex operation, like interact with 8 different DeFi protocols in the same transaction, end a loan, do a flash loan here, there, spend this money and transfer 10 things, then that might cost, that's a much more complex operation. And so it uses more of this scarce resource, which is kind of abstractly the block space. And so that might be a much more expensive operation.
And gas also creates incentives. It creates incentives for Ethereum miners. They get paid in this way. And so it's something, the fees rather. And so it's something that provides motivation for people to remain within the ecosystem.
Right. So the miners, the kind of consensus participants, they are paid out in block issuance. So Ether is generated when new blocks are created, but additionally, they do get paid by including valuable transactions. So they're always kind of listening to the network and looking for the most valuable transactions in terms of the amount of gas they use and the amount of Ether they're willing to pay per gas. So the ultimate fee paid out to them. They want to include valuable transactions so they can get the most fees.
Yeah. And so given that you have this complex system, you've got a lot of different players who are constantly, monitoring the ecosystem to figure out like what they're going to put in and all of this, and combined with the fact that no one owns or controls Ethereum, right? So there is the Ethereum Foundation, of which, you are a researcher there, and that is an entity, but it does not own Ethereum or control Ethereum. So how does that work? Like, how do you make decisions about how to develop something when there's no ultimate arbiter? There's no hierarchy there. How does that work?
How do you herd the cats is the way I would.
Yeah, exactly.
It's tough. I mean, there's it's quite fundamentally a difficult problem. Ultimately, what a blockchain network is what users choose to run and what miners or validators, the consensus entities, choose to show up and validate because they think it's valuable. And that is ultimately dictated by the software that I as a user choose to run and that we as users in aggregate choose to run. Obviously, usually we all agree and we run the same version of the software, but that doesn't always happen. For example, ETH Classic exists because a number of people decided we're not running the same version of the software as everyone else, and we have our own network now. So usually we're trying to not do that. Usually we're trying to all agree on something. And if we do iterate and upgrade, as I said, this protocol is not complete. There's many things that the Ethereum community and developers kind of demand from a system like this that we're not quite there. We're working on it. How is that decided? There are many different forums and channels that things are happening. I think foundationally, any sort of proposal that is going to make it into Ethereum mainnet goes through this EIP process, Ethereum Improvement Proposal, where people propose ideas, technical specs, essentially. There's a number of community members and editors that like go through and make sure these ideas are actually sound in the sense that like they are implementable, that they say that they do what they say they're going to do. But then, so then you have an EIP that is ultimately implementable, but that doesn't mean it's never going to be implemented. There's many, many more EIPs than have ever been brought into production. And then from there, there's much debate amongst developers, usually in very public settings. There's like an R&D Discord. There's like huge active debate every day. I wake up and there's like hundreds of unread messages. It's kind of crazy. Like it never sleeps. And there's very public calls where the merits of various proposals are brought to the table. And ultimately, client developers, and there's many client teams. Clients are an implementation of the protocol, meaning there are abstractly these rules that are Ethereum, and there are different ways to implement it by writing software. And there's a number of teams that do that. These teams ultimately decide what to bundle in their software. They all try to agree on what they will bundle in that software and which features kind of go in. There's a number of considerations, especially in these early days, on what type of upgrades will make it to mainnet. Often users want certain features, like if they had feature X, they could do this other new fantastic thing on Ethereum. And there's a lot of people that want to do this new fantastic thing on Ethereum, and maybe it's not too difficult to get out. So that type of proposal every once in a while makes it in. But the more critical proposals, rather than just nice to have features, usually focus around security and scalability. So the primary mandate, I'd say, for the next few years of Ethereum developers and of the community is to ensure that Ethereum is secure and to ensure that Ethereum continues to move on its path to scalability. And so a number of the EIPs that make it under consideration focus on these two things, security and scalability. And what I spend all of my time on is this more abstract, very large set of upgrades that we're attempting to do called ETH2, which encompass a lot of the scalability work that I talked about.
So I want to pause there for a minute, because I think that's something that is so important for even people who are deep in this space don't necessarily understand the complexity around governance, like just how hard this is to do. And I think if you just think about trying to get your group of friends to agree on where you're going on your first post-COVID vacation and how hard that is, you can imagine, like, scale that now, right? Across geographies, across preferences, across agendas. And you can imagine the sheer complexity of what has to happen in order for these kinds of changes to be made and then implemented. And so it really is I think it's important to draw connections here without getting too lofty about it, to democracy. And so one thing I've used to explain governance to people is, we had a constitution in the United States, to kind of ground this in an American example. And we were governing a country, we were running a country, and we were doing all kinds of stuff while that constitution was still getting kind of baked, right? And then we had the Bill of Rights, and that came up, and the complexity around that. It was certainly easier to get something like the Bill of Rights through in the earlier days of our country's history, or this country's history, than it was to get amendments later, right? But you still had this mechanism of how you agree upon changing, but it doesn't mean that you're waiting to like launch America, right? And so the other thing that I'll just say is that, this whole space we've talked about, this decentralized finance or DeFi space, that exists really on top of Ethereum. At the same time, you're getting a lot of attention around decentralized finance and these new models. It's important to recognize that all of that is predicated upon this governance of Ethereum, the sort of underlying infrastructure, if you want to put it that way, working, and that it moving in these directions effectively. And that is something that Danny is core to, and why we're so excited, Danny, in part, to have you on here today. So thanks for walking our audience through that.
Yeah, and that's a very apt and interesting comparison, because, and part of what I believe is in these blockchain networks, I think ossification of the core protocol is probably is valuable in the long run, and probably by design in a certain sense, and just in the same sense that it's very difficult to amend the Constitution today. That it's like borderline impossible sometimes.
Yep.
And that's maybe a good thing, because you can't have giant corporate interests like come in and start meddling with things that are very foundational and other things, and like you can't have very like flippant interactions with the Constitution that way. And similarly, and you've seen this, I think, massively so in Bitcoin, is the protocol is ossified. I think that much of the Bitcoin developer space and much of the Bitcoin user space think it's never upgrading again. And maybe that probably fits its purposes.
It's often described as a feature, not a bug, right? And
Right.
That's an aspect of it. But as you said from the outset, that cannot be the case with Ethereum. Like, it has to be this evolving thing.
Exactly.
So in light of that, and with I think we're $200 billion now in market cap for ETH, and so the money at stake in ETH itself, not to mention the value that's captured in DeFi and everything else, is really, really important. There's so much more at stake, which I think brings you to these moments of the comparison, almost like the more established state of the American Constitution that's hard to change because there's so much more at stake. So in light of everything you've talked about, right, you've got this governance challenge. You have a lot of value, and the more that ETH is rising, and the more the DeFi, which you have no control over, the DeFi guys are just going to keep doing their own thing. Well, that's all happening, and now this we talked about gas and what it actually represents, and in some respects, the fees are an encapsulation of the scaling challenge, right? Because there's only so much transactability that can be jammed through the existing base layer blockchain. Okay. So the next phase of this, Danny, on that, all of that set up, 2.0, walk us through, how does it address this challenge? How do you get to a scalability? There are various pieces to it. I've mentioned the beacon chain. Why does proof of stake matter? So I'm giving you a bunch of tasks here. Why does proof of stake matter? And give us a little bit on sharding, and how does it all work with this scalability challenge?
From very early on, there's been this notion of moving Ethereum's consensus from proof of work to a more secure, sustainable, and scalable protocol. This, in early writings on the Ethereum Foundation blog, and early writings of Vitalik and other early contributors, often involved moving towards proof of stake. Proof of stake, instead of burning tons of computational power as your economic resource for this crypto economic protocol, and instead you lock up capital. And so there you get the more sustainable from an energy and resource consumption perspective. Proof of stake also has, from our research and perspective, better security properties than our proof of work models. There are a few reasons for this. One is that in proof of stake, the capital that is dedicated to the protocol is not only can not only be rewarded, but it can actually be penalized. And so there's this notion of in proof of work, if you do something evil, nobody can burn down your mining farm. Whereas in proof of stake, because the asset is actually in protocol, if you do something demonstrably nefarious, your assets can actually be penalized instead of rewarded. So it has different security properties, many actually nice security properties. We can get into that more if you want. And finally, this third one, so we had sustainability, security, and ultimately scalability. Scalability in Ethereum is likely going to come in the form of sharding, which is essentially putting more resources under the same consensus model. So instead of having like a single chain under the consensus model, you can have many chains in parallel under the consensus model. And sharding is intricately linked to proof of stake consensus because of the requirement to randomly sample and move consensus entities across these different shards. In proof of stake, you have a much more clear and concrete notion of the consensus participants in the form of the validators. And so you're able to do more sophisticated orchestration of these validators to make a more scalable system.
So I don't know if you guys know, Danny, but CoinDesk is actually now a staker. We're staking on the Beacon chain. We
That's awesome.
Acquired 32 ETH, and we're doing it as an experiment. By the way, whatever profit we made, and wow, we've actually have made a profit already just by virtue of getting it on the ground floor in December, is all going to charity. So I need to put that out there. This is not a way that I'm going to sort of pay for the expansion of my team. But it's most important. It's a learning experience for us. It's a chance for us to report on this experience and to be there as this fascinating project gets underway. It's called Valid Points. It's a wonderful, really great newsletter written by Christine Kim and William Foxley. So check it out. It's a weekly newsletter that gives an update all the time on where things go. You can find it on coindesk.com. So they're documenting their experience, but like, how are things going so far, right? This is the beacon chain is one first step, and you've locked up, I don't know how many validators it is, but each has got 32 ETH. And they can't get rid of it at this stage. I like to think of it as an interesting bond. It's like they're earning that, but they can't do anything with it. It's and I'm waiting for somebody to tokenize that. I suppose they already have, and I could maybe find liquidity by selling it out somewhere else. I'd be interested to see.
I'm sure someone has created.
They're working on it.
There must be, right? There must be.
So,
but yeah, like, to talk. How's the experience been so far, and what are you actually trying to learn and develop through this process?
Right. So, as we've said a number of times, Ethereum today is built and secured by a proof of work consensus algorithm. And as I've mentioned, we plan on moving to a proof of stake consensus algorithm that has fundamentally some different properties, as well as some scalability gains. This is a huge endeavor. And being a huge endeavor, and being, if you look at the value of Ethereum and all the activity there, it needs to be done securely. It needs to be done safely. It needs to be done in a conservative fashion. And so what we've done, what the Ethereum network, Ethereum community has done in December, was bootstrapped this new proof of stake consensus mechanism in relative isolation from the existing chain. And so I think it was December 1st, December 2nd. I should know that.
December 1st, I think.
December 1st, the Beacon chain was launched with, I think it was 500,000 ETH locked up in it. And this consensus mechanism is now live, operating, building and securing itself, demonstrating some of the foundational properties of itself that it can finalize, that it can deal with this live scenario where there's thousands of nodes and tens of thousands, even 100,000 validators distributed across this thing. And what we're doing really is vetting this initial proof of stake consensus mechanism in a production setting. And what we'll do from here is iteratively upgrade that consensus mechanism until it's ready to be the new home for Ethereum. And at which point, the proof of work mechanism would be hot swapped for this beacon chain proof of stake mechanism, where at one point in time, the previous block would be built by the miners, and the next block, these beacon chain validators would then take over. You'd have kind of an uninterrupted sequence of Ethereum state and transactions. So DeFi at one point would be built by proof of work, and at the next point built by proof of stake. And so it's essentially the same activity, but living in a new home. And that is kind of the trajectory. That's what we're doing. And simultaneously, the beacon chain will be upgraded and extended to be able to handle more capacity than the current Ethereum chain to provide scalability gains.
So let me again contextualize this, I think, for some of our listeners who are not maybe more technically minded on this. So proof of work and proof of stake are really how these miners, how they have skin in the game. Okay, so their incentives, essentially, there's a mechanism for how these kind of blocks are created, and kind of this whole thing, stays afloat, if you will. And so the transition here, I'm trying to think of a good analogy. So GM announced last week, I think it was last week, that they are going to focus on electric vehicles, on EV, and they, in line with their plans to be net zero, they want to completely phase out gas and diesel powered vehicles. And they want to do that in some time frame. Okay, so every single automobile that they put out there is now going to be compliant with a brand new set of standards and kind of do this. And that is obviously very dramatic, and it has huge effects on the market. But imagine if, to make that decision, they had to go to every current GM owner, in the entire country, sort of get some sort of understanding this was going to happen. It was going to actually affect all of those people. Okay. Right. Then what the beacon chain is, it's kind of like a prototype, if you will. It's okay, here's what it's going to look like. Here's the first example of this new automobile. And so you can kind of kick the tires on a bit, you can kind of explore a little bit, whatever. But then there's going to be a moment where, surprise, all of you, poof, have this new thing. Okay. At the same time, again, to give you a sense of the magnitude of what we're talking about here, there's an awful lot of bells and whistles being built on top of the existing automobile. And this is DeFi, it's what we talked about before, it's the NFTs, it's these entire ecosystems that are living on top of this underlying foundation. And so when that changes, you can imagine, right? Like there's a lot of people paying a lot of attention to this because it has the potential to provide tremendous benefit in terms of the scaling and security that Danny's talked about. But it also has the potential to maybe have other implications that not everyone is going to foresee right away. And so a lot of attention is being paid to this. And I think it's to the credit of the Ethereum Foundation and all of the researchers and developers there that there isn't, people aren't like anxious and there's not drama around this. It's sort of like it's been expected for a while, it's been handled, but the sheer volume of constituents and stakeholders that are going to be involved or have been involved or affected by this at a hopefully relatively invisible layer kind of way is really mind-blowing. So yeah, I think that's imperfect clearly, but I wanted to kind of give another really different example of how to think about just the scale of what we're talking about here with ETH 2.0.
Absolutely. And so something I think that we have going for us in terms of the Ethereum ecosystem is that 9 out of 10, maybe 99 out of 100 Ethereum people, this is the only way. Like since very early on, we're like, we're going to scale this thing and it's going to be proof of stake. And everyone is just like anxiously awaiting that day. And you can see that, I mean, the amount of hobbyists and kind of core Ethereum folks that have participated in this early beacon chain thing, is like, they believe in it. They're ready for it. They all have skin in the game and they all have capital locked up until ultimately this merge. And so I'd say even if the Ethereum Foundation leadership, even if I disappeared tomorrow, like there's enough momentum here that like the Ethereum network is going to upgrade and migrate to proof of stake. One analogy that I've liked recently, and I think probably still needs some work, but essentially the Ethereum network today is on a rocket blasting out of Earth's atmosphere. And we've run ahead to Earth's orbit. And what we're doing is we're building a sustainable space habitat for the Ethereum community. And ultimately, this rocket will dock at the space habitat. We're getting it all ready for them, and then just continue to live kind of in a sustainable way in this new space habitat. Something like that.
Yeah. Rockets are a perfect
analogy, right? Because
rockets are cool, right?
Rockets are cool. Everyone gets rockets. Rockets to the moon. I mean, look, we're all about rockets now, thanks to Elon. So why don't we move from this conversation around how the network itself is being managed, and then as we say, this fundamental positive thing, right? Because it's adding value, it's adding utility, but it's also creating challenges. Is this equally uncontrollable, independent, open source network of people building things on top? And the one that's really got the attention this time around, back 3 years ago, we had the attention of all the tokens being issued, the ERC20 tokens. Now it's about DeFi. It's this decentralized exchange. And just again, for people who are not as familiar with Ethereum, why this is exciting is to me the capacity to remove the counterparty risk that was a fundamental problem of the financial system. So I cut my teeth in my entry into Bitcoin and crypto was by virtue of being somebody who wrote about the global financial system. I came through Argentina. I wrote about the US financial crisis, the global financial crisis in 2008. And it was really very much about how, at the end of the day, these banks sitting in the middle held all the cards. And when they were too big to fail, we had to prop them up because the whole thing would go down. I don't know whether DeFi is going to fix that, because I always worry about whether or not there's some fundamental bug in one of these things that does exactly the same thing. But the tantalizing idea that you and I can enter into an exchange where I lend to you and you borrow from me, and that contract is not executed by either one of us. And so, but neither is it dependent upon some person, but rather a network that is maintained this way, suddenly starts to look really powerful when you place it against that. And then we start to build insurance and we build all these other things on top of it. The idea that we could now have a yield curve that's not dependent upon 6 big banks in London to set LIBOR, but it's actually, something that emerges organically out of a decentralized system is really, really interesting. So anyway, I'm just giving that as a frame for people who understand what is this thing all about and why are people excited about it. But it's very Wild West right now. It is, it's crazy, right? The Legos that you refer to, all this sort of stuff. Tell me a little bit from your perspective as somebody who's trying to make sure the plumbing is working. What is it like to try to be, to maybe use Sheila's analogy, to be kind of working on, as the mechanic trying to sort of, get the carburetor working while there's some race car driver, with his foot to the floor, driving at full pace. Yeah.
So first and foremost, fortunately, these layers are very separate in the sense that I and much of the like major upgrades that we're trying to work on are in this like consensus layer, like the cradle, and this user layer where transactions and execution and the EVM and different things happening is kind of like this separated layer. And so fortunately, we can go in and work on the plumbing without disrupting much of the user layer. And that's by design. And I think that's like critical to this upgrade going well, is that if you're hanging out in DeFi land, you're not very much interrupted in this change, because the user layer is kind of just carried forward into this new cradle. So that's good. But it is sometimes I open up like gasnow.org
right.
or I look at etherscan/gas something, and I'm like, oh man, we need to fix this now.
Right. I mean, I suppose that's where the rubber meets the road. Okay, we keep on going this analogy is perfect, Sheila. Rubber meets the road. I'm
loving it. I'm doubling down.
because ultimately that's the scalability question right there, right? And if we do want this to be a financial system that is accessible to everybody and has small transactions, not just big ones, high gas fees are going to just price everybody out, and all of a sudden it's not doable. So to me, it sounds like it's accentuating the urgency. I don't know. I mean, you guys don't want to be forced to move too fast because you have to get it right. But it does just emphasize that you're kind of pushing up against the limit in terms of scalability, right?
And we've felt this quite a bit since, was it 2017?
Right.
CryptoKitties, the initial, like the first DApp that really caught on, CryptoKitties. It had very inefficient gas usage, and so I think it artificially kind of inflated the demand for this block space. But these all of a sudden these tradable cats made it like, oh crap, we have to get this done now.
Right.
And there's been dozens, I mean hundreds at this point, of people that spend all of their time working on this. I do want to, we haven't really talked about this. So there's this notion of layer one scalability, meaning the foundational platform, just like what does Ethereum provide at its base. And then there's this notion of layer two scalability, which is essentially, can we build protocols on top of the foundational protocol that allow us to, under different assumptions, do more? So like, for example, there's this notion of like a payment channel where Michael and I might enter into a payment channel. We both put some assets into this contract, and then off chain, not using any of the resources on chain, we trade back and forth cryptographic messages saying like, hey, here's $5. And he goes, well, here's $2. And ultimately, after some time of trading these messages back and forth, we can resolve the end result on chain. That's like a simple version of layer two, where essentially we make a commitment to this base layer and then later resolve the commitment in a more aggregate way. What is really exciting and going on Ethereum today, and which is likely to give us some scalability relief even before sharding, is this this whole world of what we call rollups. And rollups are essentially similar environments to Ethereum that are running in parallel that utilize the block space of Ethereum without utilizing the computation of Ethereum. So a rollup commits to many transactions at once, but then doesn't necessarily run all of the computation on Ethereum. And there's a couple of different ways you can do this. One is called optimistic rollup, where you're making these like optimistic commitments that can then be challenged. Another one's called ZK rollup, where you use advanced cryptographic techniques to prove the result of something without running all of the computation actually on chain. And both of these scale massively with the amount of block space that's available. And so even in Ethereum today, without sharding, we can get something like 50 to 100 times the transactions per second if most activity moved into these rollups, these like rollup zones essentially. And then the exciting thing is with sharding, foundationally, what we get is a ton more block space. So call it 100 times the amount of block space we have today. And so because these rollups scale with the amount of block space at layer 1, you get a multiple on it. So if you have 100 times scalability from rollups and then you have 100 times more block space, all of a sudden you have 10,000 times the scalability. And so even in early discussions around Ethereum scalability and the future of Ethereum, there's always been this notion of like, layer 1 will always be a finite resource. There are always these other techniques to be able to make commitments to layer 1 and do things in a more efficient way in layer 2. And thus, layer 2 is always going to be cheaper for certain things. And so the path towards scalability of the system is the complement of these two. And you see the same thing in Bitcoin and likely other networks. To make, Bitcoin has, I think, 1 megabyte blocks or something. There's just a very finite amount of transactions that can go in. And so there's this payment channels network called the Lightning Network, that is live and is supposed to be the solution of like, how can you actually as an end user transact in a more sane and price efficient way.
So you can actually pay for a cup of coffee with Bitcoin and not be hit with like 3 times the price of that coffee in terms of the fees, right?
Right.
So like one of the things analogy that I was really struck by, I was at MIT Media Lab for a few years before I came to CoinDesk, and Joey Ito used to describe what he saw as sort of layer 1, layer 2, layer 3, and so forth, as analogous to the structures of the protocols of the internet, right? With TCP/IP at the base layer, and then we bring in HTTP or SMTP and these others, for hypertext protocol for websites, SMTP for email, and then the apps get built on top of that, right? And I think it's a really useful way to think about it, because it means that you can not get overly hung up about the scalability and the amount of work that's being done at that base layer and start to do this. However, as you would well know, right, after Ethereum was launched in 2014, loads of copycats have come out, all saying, look, it's not going to scale. It started out with proof of work. We're going to do proof of stake immediately. We've got all sorts of other bells and whistles that allow us to trade faster, better, more reliably, and so forth. In reality, of course, Ethereum has continued to be by far the biggest and most actively used, even though in many respects it does look, at least at that base layer, as if it's more inefficient. Do they have a chance, for one? I mean, is there an Ethereum killer out there? That's always a question we come up with quite a bit. Does that matter? I mean, is the world going to have multiple chains, or does there have to be only one? I suppose also, like, if these things are better, or if they are more advanced, like the classic story that people don't understand is like, well, what if somebody comes along with a better Bitcoin? Why aren't they just going to go to that? Well, there's a network effect. There's a whole community story. Speak to that as well as if you can, but there's a bunch in there. Like, is there an Ethereum killer coming? Does it matter? And how is it that Ethereum continues to attract all this interest if it's actually old technology in some respects relative to new stuff coming out?
Yeah. And first I'm going to speak to the analogy of the layers of internet protocols. That's very fascinating, because that's kind of like you abstract functionality at different layers. And so you can kind of black box this component and then build more sophisticated components on top of it. And in terms of the layers in these blockchain protocols, some of it might be an abstraction of functionality, but some of it I think might be like the abstraction of trust. You say, okay, layer 1 provides us with this foundation of trust. So then we can make assumptions and build these other things that have slightly different trust models, but can fall back into this layer of trust.
Right.
So
the
you're more
anchor of trust is actually the blockchain.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It's almost a little bit also how a bank functions as the place that actually verifies the validity of the banknote that everybody's sharing around. Eventually it gets somewhere where somebody checks and says, yeah, that's legitimately a banknote, right? So
well, and to kind of bring back, what's turning out to be my favorite point, the trust is actually a result directly of the governance mechanism. So the reason you can trust that base protocol is because of the way the governance is decentralized, is the fact that, Michael, to a point you made earlier, it's not like someone can just come in and cut you off from access. It's that there is a very complicated scheme underlying this that ensures that there isn't a centralized person that can decide, they just don't like you and therefore you can't use their toys, right? Like it is much more complicated than that. And that does engender trust in the system.
Right. And foundationally, these protocols, the trust arguments in crypto economic protocols, which we call them, ultimately come to who is the attacker and how much capital do they have to attack this system, and if we assume that there's no attacker with X capital, then we have certain properties, which is very cool. So Ethereum killers.
Yeah.
So I think many competing projects in the programmable blockchain space make compromises for scalability gains, for usability gains, often at the expense of decentralization. This comes in many, many flavors. I think, for example, you could just take the Ethereum blockchain, you can make blocks 10 or 100 times bigger, and you'd have 10 to 100 times more block space and be able to handle more transactions, but at a cost. And that cost in that simple little lever you could pull is that all of a sudden I can't validate the Ethereum blockchain on my home computer, or maybe with the amount of bandwidth that I have at my home. And it might kick out 95% of people actually running and validating the network. And ultimately, so then you have a much more centralized network. You're relying on third-party providers and proofs and things that the network is actually as it is. And that's just a simple example. There's many different corners that you can cut. And not to say there are many very valid blockchain projects that are maybe have slightly different philosophies than Ethereum, but actually are trying to do it right. There's always a different set of compromises, I think, per project, what they're willing to do, what quality of service they're willing to provide, and what foundationally, what machines and what users and stuff they're trying to have. But so there's some projects I think that are reasonably trying to do it right. There's many projects that are cutting corners, and I don't find very interesting. I think it actually would be, if they did become the backbone of global finance, is actually very concerning, because they might have fatal security flaws or centralization vectors that all of a sudden you have 3 entities that are running global finance implicitly underneath the hood. We don't really want that. But beyond that, let's take, so there
are some impressive projects, right?
Absolutely.
Hard to say. We've got Turing Prize winners launching them. I'm deliberately not mentioning any names here just because, I don't know, the crypto tribes. If I mention one, it's not that I mentioned it. So why didn't you mention that one? So, and this time at the moment, folks, the reason we're talking about Ethereum, we'll come back to all the others at some point. But a Turing Prize winner from the MIT, the place is behind one of them, for example, right? They're impressive.
Yeah, and there's projects that I think have centralization concerns, and I hope that they don't win out, because that's not the world I'm trying to live in. Then there are projects that I think are very compelling and doing it right. And I think that for the vast majority of them, building out an organic community of users, networks, and developers is going to be very difficult. It's a very noisy space. And I think that's one of the most powerful things about Ethereum. I mean, there's a few things. One is Ethereum has a very strong philosophy of decentralization. Ethereum has a huge developer community, and increasingly
how many? What do we have any numbers of how many developers are on there, and what sort of estimates do we have?
I don't know. Someone knows. I've seen those graphs where it's Ethereum's up here and the other one's up here. But I know anecdotally, just being at massive hackathons where there's thousands of people that are hacking on a weekend. I know in terms of layer 1 and the contributions, there's hundreds of people that are working on this full time in terms of research and client development. And so I'm not saying that it's an impossible task to overtake that, but that there is certainly network effects in Ethereum that give
a
it
key point.
Give it power. And there's also just a matter of the way I think DeFi works, and the way a lot of decentralized applications, even beyond DeFi, work, is that there's naturally network effects there. In that if there are valuable things to interact with and there are valuable Legos to build on, then it makes sense to be there. Obviously, there are certain types of applications, I think, on Ethereum today that unfortunately you're gonna be like, well, I can't even interact here because it's too expensive. But I think with the coming layer 2s and ultimately sharding, we can kind of continue to capture a lot of those network effects even beyond these like very high value DeFi applications. So because of the way that these networks, because of the network effects, I think that are so critical to these networks, I don't think there's going to be 100 valuable networks. I think there might be many. And I think that very likely Ethereum will be right up there.
Yeah, well, I just pulled up Electric Capital. CoinDesk actually put this out in December. So it's 2,300 active Ethereum developers monthly versus Bitcoin, which is at a little under 400 average monthly developers. And that was across the third quarter of 2020. So I think you can, I thought it was important to kind of ground that in some actual numbers to just show the distinction there, and to recognize that all of that is happening in the context of this transition, this kind of transformation of the underlying consensus algorithm that is going to be really powerful and provide some of this scale. So just one thing I wanted to kind of pick up to clarify for some of our listeners is, so transactions, we all kind of understand what a transaction is. They're captured in blocks. So the more transactions you can fit in a block, the more transactions you can have. And so that's what the scaling concept really is kind of centered around in this conversation. So if you have significant limits on how many transactions you can do, then things are slower, they're more expensive, all the obvious things that would flow from that. And so a lot of what the transition to proof of stake is designed to do is enhance security, but I just wanted to clarify what the scalability is about here. And you can see why this is important. So with the NFTs the explosion in that space that we'll be talking about starting next week, with DeFi, which again sits kind of, you can think about it as sitting kind of on top of Ethereum, the volume of desired transactions is really going to just huge hockey stick. It already has, and it's going to continue to do so. So the sooner we can get to true scale in the Ethereum, network, the better off the ecosystem is going to be. But I thought that.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I mean, it's
the 2,300 people are quite busy and active. Yes, and a lot of demand for their services. Put it that way.
And I don't mean to hand wave about the amount of developers. And I'm glad that you pulled up the number. I think there's probably more.
I bet that's probably true. I think it's gone up since then, right? These are dated numbers, and every quarter there's more and more entry. People get trained, in this. It's a hot area. So I expect that is under.
There is sorry, but I want to sort of steer this conversation in this direction a little bit here, Danny, and that is like, it's not entirely an apples to apples comparison, right? In terms of Ethereum development and Bitcoin. I mean, you started out at the beginning talking about this is evolving thing, like there's people working on it and everything else. But one of the criticisms that come from the Bitcoin community when looking at this massive thing, saying it's too complex, like its insecurity is just there in all of that complexity, and the more layers and bells and whistles and things that are being built on it, it's just gonna, like, you want this base layer of this one trick pony that does one thing at the bottom, the TCP/IP, the Bitcoin base layer, right? That is the Bitcoin maxi kind of one of the Bitcoin maxi critique of Ethereum's. What do you say to that?
If all of our aspirations were just to be digital gold, then by all means, I think that you have enough functionality there. The aspirations of the Ethereum network, I mean, the aspirations of the internet too, is to handle much more complexity. And we often talk about this notion of functional escape velocity. Essentially, you need enough scale and enough extensibility to be able to build all those other layers on top. And I would argue that to do the types of things that we want to see and the types of things we're seeing on Ethereum, like DeFi and all the other interesting applications, is that Bitcoin doesn't have the functional escape velocity to be able to handle that. If you bring in trusted side chains and other things like that, which people do, like consortium Bitcoin sidechains, then you can get it, but you don't really get it out of the base layer. And so really what we're seeking is to meet the demand of functional escape velocity in terms of base layer scalability and base layer functionality to provide the foundation to build, you know, the global decentralized internet finance, everything that people are dreaming of. And so there is certainly there's a cost of complexity, and there's a cost of complexity in analysis. There's cost of complexity in shipping time. I can tell you that. But ultimately, I think there's a requisite base amount of functionality and complexity that you need to build the future, at least that the Ethereum community is trying to build.
Yeah, I think it really is just about like, what is the goal? You know, what is the goal of these various things? And I think the goals of Bitcoin and the goals of Ethereum are actually, in my mind, they're different. And I don't think that that's a bad thing. I think that's why my view is that there is very much room for both of these things, and that they are useful and will increasingly become useful for different aims and different purposes, you know, as time progresses.
Yeah.
And I think we're already seeing some of that. So in my mind, you know, I think there's often this Bitcoin versus Ethereum, you know, it's kind of very, like there's like a cage match one could do almost, right? And like,
if you've ever been on Twitter,
right?
that's
right. I'm sure that video has been created.
I would definitely agree. I mean, look,
yeah.
These are both like fantastic experiments in attempting to re-architect the way we do things and the way we think about things. And there are definitely similarities, right? These are crypto economic protocols that have foundational assets in them and do things in a decentralized way. But I think they ultimately are trying to do different things.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
So just one kind of maybe question as we move towards close. You know, you mentioned just thinking about the internet. And so Michael had that analogy about the different internet layers and TCP, IP, et cetera. You know, but let's get more concrete about that. Like, how do you see Ethereum helping build a better internet? Like, how do you see the work that's happening here, whether it's work around governance? I'm just going to throw that out there. You don't have to bite on that piece. You know, how is it going to help us build a better internet?
So I definitely think that Ethereum gives users of the citizens in the world a power of choice that the internet currently does not give us. Essentially, the powers that be control our data, monitor our data, use us as the product. The financial rails that we interact with are very restricted, especially for end consumers. We're not playing the same game as Wall Street. And what
we learned that fast last week. Yeah.
Yep.
And what Ethereum does, and in other decentralized technologies, is it shifts the power dynamic from these single powerful entities into networks and into individuals. And I think that disintermediating the power and kind of shifting the trajectory of the internet today is, ultimately what we're doing. I know that's a little bit hand wavy and abstract. I think with finance, it's becoming very obvious how that happens. In that, the developer down the street can write new financial contracts and interact with these new financial rails. But there are other powerful paradigms that can be built on Ethereum and decentralized technologies. One is like the notion of identity and owning your identity through cryptography and zero knowledge proofs and other things. Like, I can actually own my identity. I can share components of that to parties as I want. Another idea is like the ownership of communities. A lot of these communities that we have on the internet don't exist and don't really have a notion of themselves outside of the centralized servers that they interact in. But through these networks, you have like actual ownership, actual representation of networks, and that can exist independent of the kind of foundational entity there. I'm cautiously optimistic about some of Reddit's experiments there. I think to kind of radically move more in that direction of ownership of communities and some of their experimentations with the community points and stuff. But I think it's ultimately giving users, giving the citizens of the globe choice on the internet.
Well, that's a great place to wind this up, because it is a constant theme in Money Reimagined. The goal really is to think hard about the underlying infrastructure of the social contracts that we essentially have amongst ourselves as global citizens, and that the existing models, whether it's for finance or for these large centrally controlled internet platforms, really aren't sufficient for the world that we're creating, with this very interconnected but very fragmented and non-geographical relationships. And we talk about surveillance capitalism a bit on this show. We talk about really the problem of these big gatekeepers, and really the ultimate question of rights, citizens as digital citizens, that we maintain. So I'm really glad that you took it there, Danny. Really fantastic to have you along. Thank you for doing this. Very timely, so much happening around this. It's such a complex topic, but it's fascinating. And to have you break it down and help out people understand it and sort of have a bit of a sense of where it's all going, we're really grateful. So thanks so much for doing this. And
Yeah, absolutely.
I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. It's fun chatting.
Yeah. All righty.